My name is Bob Pollack. I'm a biology professor and the director of the Center for the Study of Science and Religion. And I'm here to welcome you, to introduce our speaker, and to say a few words about the CSSR. And then Jonathan will speak, and then I hope we'll have time for some questions from the audience as well. To begin with, let me just say that the CSSR has tried this semester to peg our events either to time or to place. So, for instance, our first seminar was Ken Edelin talking about his experience as a physician in Boston in the 70s and 60s on the anniversary of the Roe v. Wade decision. And the next two lectures will be by Francis Collins on his role in the Human Genome Project as a devout religious person, and that event will be held at Riverside Church, an appropriate place, followed by a talk by Rabbi Norman Lamb, the former chancellor of Yeshiva University, and that talk will be at Congregation Ramat Orah on 110th Street, also sponsored by the CSSR. And those bracket tonight's event, and you might wonder what is the time or place that signifies Jonathan Weiner's talk on the Beak of the Finch. Well, the first answer is, of course, that Charles Darwin was born on February 12th, 1809, and this is the 199th anniversary of his birthday, and this is Darwin Week, and so it's a perfectly reasonable time to pick for Jonathan's talk. But that's the science end of it. You might ask, what about the religious end of it? And for those of you who think the business of natural selection does not apply to humanity, or that our behavior is not in some way seriously linked to the procreation and the survival of our offspring, I just want to wish you a happy Valentine's Day. Now, on Jonathan Weiner. His website tells us the following. You'll soon see how articulate he is. His website tells us why. He majored in English at Harvard. And he has been writing about science for the last 30 years or so. He worked on the magazine The Sciences. He wrote the book for the TV series Planet Earth, and he has spent 20 years as an independent writer, that is to say, a serious person in the real world, and now is a professor of journalism at Columbia. His books include the book he'll talk about, The Beak of the Finch, winner of the Pulitzer Prize and the Los Angeles Book Prize, Los Angeles Times Book Prize, and Time, Love, Memory, his book on the work of Seymour Benzer and Fruit Flies, which is a wonderful, wonderful book, and his book, His Brother's Keeper, on ALS and the ways in which a personal life drives a religious and a scientific agenda. His talk tonight is on Beak of the Finch, on Darwin's work as it is understood by people doing that work today. And rather than natter on, I'd just like to introduce Jonathan. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bob. And thanks to all of you for turning out on Valentine's Day. I appreciate it. I want to take this opportunity, because this is a talk under the auspices of the Center for Science and Religion, to talk about questions that have occurred to me over the years as I write about science. That's a very delicate project, a very tricky project, and I feel a little bit like a young finch launching itself out of the nest on a first flight. There is much more likelihood that I'll splat on the ground than that I will that I'll find the wings. But I want to talk a little bit about the finches and the intersection of science and religion that the finches have helped to open up, and then offer this fledgling thought about the conflict and the sources of the conflict that have dogged us since long before Darwin. So when I started writing that book, The Beak of the Finch, back in 1990, I knew so little about evolution that I didn't even know it is controversial. And I found out when I was talking happily about my new project at a dinner party. And at the end of the dinner party, which was catered and had someone stationed by the coats to help you back into your coat, a woman there, as she helped me into my coat, said, "Did I overhear you saying at the table that you're writing about evolution?" And I said very happily, yes. And as if what could be more interesting? And she looked at me really skeptically and she said, "Are you for it or against it?" And I soon discovered that that was going to be a reaction I would often get, and I would always be unprepared for it. Soon after that, maybe a week later, it was time for my 6-month checkup at the dentist. And so I was lying in the dentist's chair with my mouth open, and a woman with one of those hygienic masks over her mouth was working on my mouth. And she asked me, "Well, what are you working on now?" And so I said, again, very happily, "Evolution." And she just bent really close to me, eyeball to eyeball, and she said, "Well, I'm a Jehovah's Witness, so you know what I think about that." And I didn't feel I was in any position to argue. So when I was finishing the book, I pulled an all-nighter. I was working on the last chapter, and I felt it, in fact, was my personal favorite of the chapters. It was titled God and the Galapagos. So the questions that I want to arrive at tonight were certainly on my mind then, but it was a great chapter. I really was happy with it, but naturally, the computer froze up just as I finished it, before I could print it out. And there's a Yiddish word for that. I don't know if any of you know the word dafka. The word dafka means of course, as in the bread fell off the plate. Naturally, of course, it fell on the buttered side. So, of course, the computer froze just as I was about to print out the last chapter and FedEx it to my publisher. And I've told this story before, and I'll never believe the poetic justice of this encounter. But I lugged the entire computer to a, because I just couldn't get it, I absolutely had to send it in. I lugged it to the local Apple repair shop. This was in Doylestown, Pennsylvania, where I lived then. And they had just closed. Dafka, they had just closed. And they had a glass door, and the guy behind the counter looked up and very kindly saw my frenzy and opened the door. And it turned out that he was a repair guy from the back of the shop. And he thought I was just checking it, but I explained to him I was working on a book. I just finished this chapter. I'd been up for, 48 straight hours. I had to print this out, and it was frozen. So he put it down on the counter, opened it up. He started taking it apart. And about 20 minutes later, the whole computer, or to me, the whole computer was sort of barfed out over the counter, and he was working on it, and I'm standing there, as a customer, trying to be calm, and he says, "So what's your book about?" And I said, just not learning at all. I just said, "Evolution." And the same stare, and he said, "Well, I have a PhD in engineering, and I can tell you that this Earth was created with all the life upon it in much the form we see it now 6,000 years ago." So then we just looked at each other. And out of a wonderful gift of Christian charity, he proceeded to repair the computer, and I could print out the chapter, and I sent it in. And he even forgave me for telling that story in print not long afterward when the book came out. That was in 1990. When those first adventures happened by the coat rack and in the dentist's chair. And since then, of course, we've made a lot of progress in this country. We need only look at the White House to see how much progress we've made on this particular front, or at the primaries, where we have a serious contender who said recently, if you want to believe that you and your family came from apes, I'll accept that. And he says he has no problem with evolution being taught in schools as a theory, and he says in the same spirit of compromise, we shouldn't indoctrinate kids in school. I wouldn't want them teaching creationism as if it's the only thing that they should teach. So this is Mike Huckabee, of course, and I think it's in some ways a much more conciliatory stance than one hears. On the other hand, it does seem to equate the evolutionary argument and the creationist argument as two doctrines which should be given equal weight in the schools, and that is the creationist, or now as it's relabeled, the intelligent design argument, for getting that particular camel into the tent. So I've been continually surprised by the skepticism over the facts of evolutionary theory, because back in 1990, the reason I had embarked on this book was because I was looking over the shoulders of two evolutionary biologists, Peter and Rosemary Grant of Princeton University, who go to the Galapagos Islands, Darwin's Islands, every year, and watch Darwin's finches, birds that helped lead Darwin to his theory, and watch evolution in action year by year, which Darwin himself didn't think possible. I think that the debate over evolution in the schools, the debate over evolution as only a theory, as it's framed there by Mike Huckabee and as it's been framed by so many, is so strangely simplistic, because it's starting at point A, and where I want to talk about what the Grants see a little bit, and then I want to try to go beyond that to point wherever this takes us, F, G, H, where I think the real problem lies. Because you actually can watch Darwin's process, evolution by natural selection, in action. Of course you can. Of course you can now. The curious fact is that Darwin himself didn't think you could see it happen. Darwin didn't believe that in his lifetime or in any other human lifetime you could watch. And toward the end of The Origin, in one of the last paragraphs of The Origin of Species, he writes, "The chief cause of our natural unwillingness to admit that one species has given birth to clear and distinct species is that we're always slow in admitting great changes of which we do not see the steps." We don't see it. He was convinced that evolution took place, but that it takes place with geological slowness. It was gradual, like the building up and wearing down of mountains, which his great mentor, the geologist Charles Lyell, had been writing about in Principles of Geology, a best-selling book of the Victorian era that Charles was reading as a young man on the voyage of the Beagle. So Darwin writes, emphasizing this gradual, geologically slow pace in the first chapter of The Origin, it may metaphorically be said that natural selection is daily and hourly scrutinizing throughout the world the slightest variations, rejecting those that are bad, preserving and adding up all that are good, silently and insensibly working whenever and wherever opportunity offers. We see nothing of these slow changes in progress until the hand of time has marked the lapse of ages. Ages, geological ages. So Darwin certainly did not have geological ages when he was in the Galapagos. He had only 5 weeks, in fact, in the Galapagos in the fall of 1835. And it was only after he was back home in England that he realized how interesting the finches, which he had collected only haphazardly in the islands, might be to a new approach to the problem of the origin of species, which was on his mind, greatly on his mind, on the voyage home from the Beagle, and which a philosopher of science had called that mystery of mysteries. He writes in The Voyage of the Beagle, in connection with the finches, "It is the fate of most voyagers no sooner to discover what is most interesting in any locality than they are hurried from it." The standard experience of all of us as travelers. We always realize afterward what we should have been paying attention to when we were there. He wished he'd paid more attention to the finches. He'd only collected a few dozen. He hadn't even written down in his notes which island he collected each finch from. But the reason he was frustrated that he hadn't paid more attention to the finches is that the finches and the mockingbirds and the Galapagos tortoises, he began to realize after he got back to London and professional senior biologists began looking at his trove of natural history specimens from the voyage, was that they seemed to suggest to him that ancestral colonists of the finches, or a great distant ancestor of those mockingbirds, or a far dim ancestor of all those giant Galapagos tortoises, that each of those ancestors had made its way to these little clumps of volcanic rock, these volcanic summits hundreds of miles west of the coast of South America, long back in the past, ages back in the past, and that then, generation by generation, they had adapted to this strange place that they had found themselves. The Galapagos Islands, these rocky summits, these bare volcanic deserts, being so different, no doubt, from the landscapes, from the environments in which they had been at home on the coast of South America. They had adapted, they had changed, generation by generation, they had changed progressively until now there were a baker's dozen of finches in the Galapagos Islands, a dozen different species of finches from that one ancestor. Likewise with the mockingbirds, a whole candelabra, a whole family tree of species from that original colonizer of the islands. And the same with the tortoises, which again he wished he could go back and check out, because unfortunately they had collected Galapagos tortoises, as many whaling voyages and surveying ships, the Beagle was a surveying ship, did in those days, and then they had eaten the tortoises on the way home and thrown the shells overboard. And so he didn't have the specimens that he needed to build his case. And he also, because of this belief in gradualism, in the very slow pace of change that he assumed took place in geology and in evolutionary change, he assumed that he could never document it. So what he did was he built a very logical argument for evolution by natural selection, which we have all been schooled in many times in our lives as students, and many of you as professional biologists. He built that up through wonderfully simple logical argument that could be scribbled on the back of an envelope. It's as simple as Newton's laws of motion, which could also be fitted on the back of an envelope. And then with a multitude of examples from which one could infer that a story like that could take place, in which species could be modified, a population could change generation by generation. But he didn't think he could see it. So Peter and Rosemary Grant started going to the Galapagos in 1973, and fairly early on in their study of the finches, in 1977, there was a terrible drought year. And at the start of that year, on this tiny island, Daphne Major, which is a little speck of a desert island in the middle of the archipelago. Have any of you been to the Galapagos, I wonder? A few. But I'm sure you did not stop on Daphne Major. It's so steep all the way around that the average tourist ship would not be able to approach it, except you'd have to approach it in a panga, a little Zodiac, and then you'd have to climb a cliff in order to reach the only trail that leads up. And this is what Peter and Rosemary Grant have to do with all of their supplies year after year, because there's no food and water for human beings on the island. Well, at the start of '77, there were 1,200 medium-beaked ground finches. I said there are about a dozen species of finches. Taxonomists are always adding or subtracting, lumping or splitting, but say a dozen still. The medium-beaked ground finch, which usually dines on medium-sized seeds on Daphne, numbered about 1,200 at the start of the year, and by the end of the year, in the course of the drought, so many had died, they were down to only 180, a loss of 85%. The Grants and their graduate students studied the numbers. They studied the measurements of the finches going into the drought and the finches coming out of the drought, and they found that finches with the bigger beaks had survived. The finches with the smaller beaks had died, and beyond that, the finches that survived tended to have not longer beaks and not wider beaks, but deeper and narrower beaks. Those finches were also the ones, picture a parrot beak when I say deeper and wider. They had a visibly more parrot-like beak rather than, say, a needle-nosed pliers sort of beak. Those finches were finding the last big, tough seeds on the island that nobody else could crack. It's like those pistachio nuts at the bottom of the bowl for which you have to get out practically in needle-nosed pliers. They were able to get their beaks, the deep and narrow beaks, between the spikes of this armored tough seed called tribulus, which means trouble, of course, the same root as the word tribulation, and crack those and make it through. So those birds tended to be male because the males are larger than the females, and so the males had an advantage in this selection event, as it's called. And there were now, after that terrible attrition, there were now 6 males on the island for every female. When the rain finally came, because there had been no rainy season the year before, when the rain finally came, those males, this huge, relatively large crowd of males, all did what they ritually do in the rainy season. They flew up to the top of cactus trees. They began singing. When females came to look at their territory, they would fly in this elaborate and very energetically expensive courtship dance. And then the females would choose among the males. So the females had a choice, quite an extreme choice. And you could say that sexual selection, another coinage of Darwin's, sexual selection pressure was now extreme, just as natural selection pressure had been before. And it turned out that the female finch was choosing the male finch with the most parrot-like beak, so that even within that selection event, the sexual selection pressure now pushed the selection even farther. It was those males with the very most parrot-like beaks who got to pass on the genes that had given them that lucky piece of equipment. The offspring of those males and females had visibly changed dimensions. You could just look at them and you could see that evolutionary change had taken place. And of course, the Grants and their grad students that year, Peter Bogue and Laureen Ratcliffe, were able to document all of this in great detail. But every step of Darwin's abstract argument had now been documented before their eyes in the space not just of a human lifetime, but in the space of a single generation on this little desert island. And very simply, I mean, it is as simple. Newton's laws of motion are essentially quite simple, and we witness their consequences all the time when we drop something or when we move something and when we push a heavy object. And these become, once one begins to watch, the most intuitively obvious sorts of motions and transformations that you could ask for. And they do lead to this simple evolutionary change. I want to just read a passage from the Beak of the Finch that follows that story of that terrible drought, ends that chapter. So the birds were not simply magnified by the drought, they were reformed and revised, they were changed by their dead, their beaks were carved by their losses. In most places on this planet, the sight of a dead bird is so rare that it shocks us, even scares us. We recoil as if something has gone wrong in the cosmos, as if a shutter has creaked open that should have been kept closed, exposing a shadow world beyond our world, a place we were not meant to see. But on the desert island of Daphne Major, dead birds are commonplace. They're everywhere. The lava is always littered with wishbones and beaked skulls. Whole seabirds lie outstretched here and there as if still in flight, odorless and mummified like feathered pharaohs in the dry and desiccating heat. Each generation lies where it falls, and the next generation builds on the ruins of the one before. They hatch in a morgue, breed in a crypt, and lie down with their ancestors as if here not only life but death too is asking to be watched. Evolution discloses a meaning in death, although the meaning is like some of the berries that Darwin tasted in the Galapagos, acid and austere. There is a special providence in the fall of a sparrow. Even drought bears fruit, even death is a seed. A few years after that drought year, there was a very wet year in the Galapagos. It was an El Nino year. The rains were incredibly intense. Daphne turned from a desert to a green emerald. Grass covered it within a week. And it was very hard for those deep-beaked birds to find tribulus seeds, to find anything they could crack competitively well compared to the little guys with the more needle-nosed beaks among the medium-beaked ground finches. The ones that had the advantage were the little guys with the little sharp beaks who could do very well with the little grass seeds that now covered the island. And so you can easily imagine what kind of evolutionary change took place. Once again, there was selection pressure. The large guys, the big guys with the big beaks, many of them didn't make it through because they were so slow. You need a lot more grass seed in order to make it through if you're a big-bodied animal. And they were relatively big. They needed a lot of seeds, and some of them didn't make it through even in that land of plenty, where the little guys, as I say, flourished and prospered. And sexual selection again ran rampant, this time because there was so much food around that the birds went through several breeding seasons just in the course of that 1 year. And once again, the females chose the males with the hot beak of that year, and sexual selection and natural selection once again combined to push the pendulum in the opposite direction. And now, again, there was an measurable evolutionary change. So the Grants have continued to watch and to learn from these birds. In fact, although I haven't been in touch with them in a few months, this is the beginning of the rainy season in the Galapagos, and I bet they are there right now. They are, by watching so closely, they are teasing out extraordinarily interesting and revelatory work that not only in this simple schematic way that I've described in summary, lays out what Darwin imagined but didn't think he could see, but also goes beyond what Darwin talked about, because there is so much information there. There's so much that you can see in the watching. And we need more and more field studies like this. Fortunately, there are more and more studies like this in order to understand the details of the origin of species. The Grant study is still the flagship in the field, but the field gets more sophisticated every year, and so does this Finch work. They're now tracing the finch's evolution at the level of the genes back to that ancestor in South America. There's a nice gene story to tell there. And there's an even better one told by a group of molecular biologists at Harvard working with the Grants, who not too long ago nailed down a key protein that's involved in shaping the beaks of the finches. It's a signaling molecule called bone morphogenetic protein 4, BMP4. And it turns out that finches with bigger beaks tend to have more BMP4. Finches with smaller beaks have less. And in the lab, they can demonstrate that they can sculpt the beaks themselves by adding or subtracting BMP4. And what's beautiful about this is that once again, this is an icon of evolution at the very simple, fundamental, I should say, level that Darwin laid out in the 19th century, and now at the level of the genes. Because it turns out that that same gene that sculpts the beak of the finch also sculpts the faces of all animals on the planet, including our human faces in the womb. So now, why is this story so perennially hard to take for so many people? Back in the 1800s, of course, it was highly charged. Charles Darwin made himself sick for 20 years trying to collect enough data, enough evidence, and bring himself to tell this story in a forthright, clear way that would convince. His wife, Emma, was terrified that they would be separated in eternity because she would go to heaven and he would not. And Emma confessed her fears in a letter which Charles saved and treasured with his reply to her scribbled in the margin. "Know when I am gone how many tears I have cried over this." So that was Victorian England. Why are we still a house divided? So it remains true, of course, that the largest changes we're talking about are still invisible to us. What we're talking about in the Grant's work and in many other studies of evolution in action are what is known as microevolution. We're not talking about macroevolution, which is the sort of change that many people now believe took place as one offshoot of the dinosaurs, for instance, became what we call birds. There's a wonderful paleontologist here at Columbia, at Lamont Doherty, who visited my class at the journalism school last week, who is one of the ardent proponents of this theory, and he likes to say again and again, this is Paul Olson, dinosaurs did not go extinct. Dinosaurs are among us. The birds are dinosaurs, and they are the dinosaurs are still spectacularly successful. Well, you can read that story pretty well. You can read a lot of stories very, very well in the fossil record, but you are not there to watch, as the Grants are there to watch this microevolutionary step. So that's part, at least, as Darwin said in The Origin, as Darwin himself said, that's part of the reason why people resist all of this. But I don't think that's all. Because it is such a compelling, powerful, and simple story, essentially, that Darwin is telling, that I think reason has to go there if reason is willing to go there at all, to start down this road. And an evolutionary biologist told me a story, not the Grants, but another evolution in action guy named John Endler, who watches evolution in action among guppies, that he was on an airplane once, and somebody asked him what he did, and he said he was a biologist. And the man asked, well, what kind of biology? What do you study? And he said, well, I work on these guppies. And what do you do with the guppies? What's interesting about guppies? And he talked about these changes that take place in these tanks that he has and in streams in Trinidad, and he can watch these changes, and he can see how the pressure of these really fierce cichlid fish make the males more drab when there are a lot of cichlid fish around in the tanks or in the streams in Trinidad. But when there aren't any cichlids around, the males over a few generations become as colorful as clowns, because all those colors help them in their courtship dances with the females. And as he's unfolding this story, his passenger mate is saying again and again, his seatmate, wow, that's really cool. I never knew that would happen to guppies. Does that happen to other living things too? And he says, oh yeah, this happens all over the world, all the time. And as they were landing, as John Endler tells the story, he said, you know, it is an amazing story, isn't it? And that story is the story of evolution. And he says, the man turned purple. So I think the story itself is not what repels. There's something deeper. And I am conscious now, as I begin to try to fly out of this nest, that many, many generations of people have tried to make this particular flight what bothers us so much about this. And this may be an awfully young and juvenile attempt, but I have been thinking about, since arriving here at Columbia 2 years ago, I've been thinking about it from a perspective that at least is interesting and feels promising to me. By taking us out of ourselves, by following as far as reason can go, we are insulting our own sense of dignity in a certain way that I think happens again and again, not only in the science of evolution, but in many other areas of science, again and again, and also in our own lives, if we stop to make the connection. Science allows us to figure out what is happening when we're not there to watch. At least it's our best way of approaching an understanding of what's going on when we're not there to watch. That was how Darwin used it, though he could never go back to the Galapagos any more than Neil Armstrong could have gone back to the moon. It's a disciplined exercise of reason that somewhat mysteriously in its effectiveness allows us to know what is going on in the Galapagos right now, even though Darwin, for instance, could never go back to see it, having been hurried from it on the Beagle. I think by taking ourselves out of ourselves in this highly disciplined way that we call science, this extension of reason deals us as mortals an insult from which we really can't easily recover. Freud said so famously, it's always quoted, that science has dealt us a series of insults, that Copernicus insulted our sense of specialness by showing that you could look at the solar system as having the sun in the center and that we go around that rather than that the universe revolves around us. Darwin shows that you can see us as one little twig on the tree of life rather than having all of creation revolve around us. Freud himself, he was pleased to put himself last and in a sort of crescendo in this sequence, but Freud helps to show us that even our own consciousness is not as central and as controlling of our experience as we would have thought and liked to think. So why is it that all these guys are pointing us in this same difficult direction? I mean, what is it about this exercise of disciplined exercise of reason that keeps pushing us toward this same sort of insult? And it isn't just evolution, the study of evolution, that gives us this insult. It's also any study of physiology. I mean, after The Beak of the Finch, I wrote a book called Time, Love, Memory, in which I looked over the shoulders of biologists who were looking at the springs, the clockwork within a fly that gives it a sense of time. That's another story. But looking through the microscope at the brain of a fly, and it does have a brain, a very fancy and elaborate brain, which you can see through the microscope is staggering, gorgeously complex. You just think, is that all there is then? It's the same sort of feeling one has in an operating room, looking at a patient opened up, which I have done in a field trip with my students up in watching open heart surgery and looking at a heart beating. And again, one has this same troubled feeling. I think this sense that there is a common insult to all of this and that we haven't quite expressed it clearly to ourselves crystallized for me when I picked up a little book at one of those tables on Broadway soon after arriving here by a philosopher named Thomas Nagel. The book was called The View from Nowhere. And he says in that book, the fundamental idea behind the objective impulse is that the world is not our world. The universe was there before us, in other words, and the universe will go on after we are gone. And we feel this on a large and a small scale all the time whenever we exercise our own reason. Whenever we look at our lives in an objective way, we receive this same insult again and again. This is, I think, what we mean by growing up, in fact, very often. Even just thinking about places that we've been and that we can't go back. We feel a pang because we can't go there. We can't go back. It is the fate of every voyager to be hurried along, day by day. And that is our condition. That is our condition as much as that we are a twig on the tree of life is our condition. And reason helps us to see that, whether we like it or not. And science helps us cultivate this detachment and this striving toward objectivity that shows us this same fact in every direction that we look. But the trouble with this deliberate detachment, as Nagel argues in View from Nowhere and in many other of his philosophical books, is that it leads, as he says, to false reductions or to outright denial that certain patently real phenomena exist at all. In other words, as we step outside ourselves, as we strive toward objectivity, we lose our sense of the subjective experience that is indeed central to our lives day by day, again and again. And we find it very hard, I think, to put together the objective and subjective views in one unified picture. If we could, it would amount to a worldview. And he says he doesn't have that himself. In fact, he says, one of my claims is that often the pursuit of a highly unified conception of life and the world leads to philosophical mistakes, to false reductions, or to the refusal to recognize part of what is real. So this is what I don't like about so much writing about evolution and so much writing about science in general. Dawkins, for instance, who recently brought out a book, The God Delusion, is much more to be commended, I think, for an earlier book he wrote, The Blind Watchmaker, which is a brilliant, brilliant exposition of this very simple story that Darwin tells us of evolution by natural selection. But listen to the way he starts this book. This is absolutely characteristic in the direction that he's gone now with the God Delusion. He starts, this book is written in the conviction that our own existence once presented the greatest of all mysteries. He's hearkening there to that phrase, the mystery of mysteries, the origin of species. Our own existence once presented the greatest of all mysteries, but that it is a mystery no longer because it is solved. Darwin solved it. Well, he solved that mystery of mysteries, the origin of species, but I think a deeper mystery still clearly remains. And it is excessively simplistic to argue that existence has now been explained, existence has been solved, when even as deep a philosopher as Nagel, or even as deep a philosopher as all of us in this room, because we all brood about this very problem, I think, in our growing up, year by year, day by day, daily and hourly, as Darwin says in describing evolution by natural selection. We brood about this, and I don't like the harshness of Dawkins in addressing it in phrases like, he often says, to bring up a child in a religious home is the equivalent of child abuse. Another voice of that same stern temper is Steven Weinberg, the great physicist and cosmologist, who has said at the end of his book, the first 3 minutes about the birth of the universe, the more we know of the universe, the more it seems pointless. It is true from one point of view, as we get outside ourselves in this effort to take ourselves out of the picture, that we no longer find purpose and point in the same sense that we find it in our own lives. At least it isn't obvious to us yet in looking at the cosmos or in watching the Finches on Daphne Major. And yet, we experience meaning intensely, day by day, hour by hour. A Wonder rabbi expressed this same sort of paradox, I think, that our lives confront us with and that our science confronts us with, in saying that you could carve the whole mystery on a rock. If you inscribed on one side of the rock, the universe was created just for me, and on the other side, I am dust. And Melville, when Melville was in the Galapagos, about the same time as Charles Darwin, also a young sailor, he was on the whaling ship, the Cushnet. He was there to collect tortoises, again, to bring them on board the ship to eat them. And He writes in his novella, The Encantadas, which is set in the Galapagos, that one side of the tortoises, the top is dark, the bottom is light. He says, if you flip them over, you see something light. If you flip them back, you see something dark. He says, remember that. Remember that. If you want to turn things over so that you see only one side, fine. But don't pretend that the other side doesn't exist. He says it more poetically than that. But that's the same message of the Wonder Rabbi. That's the same message I think we're confronted with again and again in our daily experience, and certainly in confronting these very wide views that science offers us. And I think that to pretend that one side doesn't exist, one side of the rock, one realm of purpose, another of apparent purposelessness, is to miss the real problem of existence and to leave out half of the universe in which we live and which we're trying to understand. It may be akin to the problem for which Nagel is best known. His best known paper is What Is It Like to Be a Bat? And he argues that we can't know that. Again, that very question takes us out of ourselves in the way that the exercise of reason and of empathy does too. We can't know what it's like to be a bat, but we're sure that it's like something different from what it's like to be, say, that pebble on which you could inscribe messages on one side or the other. It's like something to be alive. And I wonder if our own neglect of our sense of meaning in the world will someday seem just as absurd and unscientific within the scientific construction of the universe as the failing of many biologists earlier actually for a good part of the 20th century to acknowledge that it's like anything to be a bat. For a good amount of time, as many of you know, behaviorists argued that it was like nothing to be a bat or a mouse. It was a very convenient tenet to hold if you were using mice in mazes or in medical tests. It is like something to be a bat or a mouse. It is like something to be a human being, and it is a powerfully meaningful and difficult experience. And I'm not arguing here something as simple-minded as because science can't explain everything, therefore Darwin was wrong, or therefore God must exist in those gaps in our reason's effort to construct the way things are. I'm just saying that's too simple, that scientism that denies one side of our experience, that takes us into a view from nowhere and forgets that we actually are here to watch, is not as wise as the humility of Darwin himself, who, writing to his religious friend Gray, an American botanist, said, "You say that you are in a haze after reading The Origin of Species. I am in thick mud. The orthodox would say in abominable mud, yet I cannot keep out of the question." He himself was puzzled. He himself was staggered by this problem. I don't think anybody to this day is farther ahead with this problem than we've been in the whole course of human existence. And so I think we need the humility to accept all of the data of reason and of the emotions. What our reason tells us happens when we're not there to watch. What our hearts tell us happens when we are there to watch, not to leave out either. And it was in that spirit that I chose for the Beak of the Finch an epigraph from the book of Job. "And where is the place of understanding? It is hid from the eyes of all living and concealed from the birds of the air. Thanks very much.
Well, I want to thank Jonathan for a very generous approach, and I would welcome questions from the audience. There is a microphone down here. If Andrew's got one, if you raise your hand, he'll signal. Okay, and I'll close with my own question.
Okay.
Hi.
Hi.
In an argument with a born-again Christian some time ago, he offered the viewpoint that no species had ever been created by the process of mutation. And as a biologist, I'm a little bit ashamed to say that I couldn't come up with a specific example myself. But I'm thinking, in this age of genomics, is it possible that we can catch the process of mutation in the act of creating a new species?
Absolutely it is. It's a good question. And in fact, fruit fly guys, as they call themselves, have seen that for generations. And botanists have seen the creation of a new species through mutation for many generations. And all that is required in Darwin's argument is that the mutation should create a population that can no longer breed back easily with the previous generation, and so becomes reproductively isolated. I mean, the finches, the ancestral finches, were blown over hundreds of miles of the Pacific, and they were in that way reproductively isolated from all those flocks of home. And so little mutations, chance mutations, gradually accumulated in those finches in that isolation. But geographic isolation isn't the only kind of isolation that can set one gene pool apart from another, as you know as a biologist. And if a mutation arises, for instance, say a change in the number of chromosomes, which has been observed to happen in plants, in a mutation among these fruit flies. I think it was a species called Drosophila polystorum. I don't know why that's still in my memory bank, but there it is. A mutation there produced flies that could breed among themselves if they all had that mutation, but couldn't breed with other Drosophila polystorum. So that mutation then isolates them from all the rest of the Drosophila polystorum. There's a really pretty large literature on this. So you could answer your friend with chapter and verse there. I should say, though, that those arguments are very hard to win, because your friend will be likely to go on from that question, if your answer satisfies, to another question which you don't really have the answer to off the top of your head, and so on, and so on, and so on.
So thank you for these wonderful stories, and I am more fascinated by the biology and the ethology rather than the philosophy. Mm-hmm. And I am wondering if the grants had ever thought of perhaps writing a grant, if they haven't noticed themselves, to bring along a behaviorist to try to explain the mechanisms of the female selection in those courtship events after the drought and then after the floods, if you will. Whether it's by some sort of social learning? Did they actually observe the shape of the beak and the success at cracking the seeds, etc.? Was it some sort of behavior on the part of the male during the courtship? Were when we go back to the parrot-like beaks, were they behaving more bolder, or what was it? Was it pheromonal? Could microbiologists find some sort of protein or something else in the makeup of the males with the successful beaks?
It's a really good question. The grants have been interested in that question. I mean, what is it then that the females are choosing? What are they selecting about those males? They have done studies with dummy males and dummy females and broadcasting courtship songs and the rest of it to try to figure out what it is, what features the males and females are paying attention to. And it looks as if the beaks are really important. They're studying each other's beaks at least as carefully as the grants are studying the beaks. Now, beyond that, there's another question that I think you're asking too, which is what makes that beak the hot beak of the year? And the grants have suggested, and I think other biologists also, because this is a much more general question than just what's going on Daphne major in a drought, but they think that probably those birds were bolder in some way, as you say. They were healthier, they were more energetic, they had been eating better than the others. In that crowd of males that the females could pick among, there were those who had the perfect beak for eating tribulus seeds. They were really pretty fine, and they could fly higher, presumably. Their black coats of feathers were shinier and glossier and healthier. And so there were all sorts of other cues that went along with the beaks that suggested to the female this is an attractive, successful male. That's at least one argument. You have to notice, though, that this is not a foolproof mating system, because the hot beak, as we've seen, the hot beak one year can be death warmed over 3 years later. And so it's a little bit like weather forecasting when you really can't get at the weather report. The safest forecast is always tomorrow's probably going to be a lot like today. And that's about what this system, if that's how it's working, what this system does for the female finch choosing the male. Probably tomorrow, next year, will be like this year. Probably that beak is going to be good. That whole suite of characters is going to be good next year. So this is the best I can do. I'm choosing the bird that's healthy now. And that, of course, is... You don't need to reason your way through all of that to be a female finch choosing a male after the rains come. And, as we all know from our experience, you don't do all that much reasoning in the same situation in our own species. Yeah, I think...
Before. It occurs to me that, to put him on the spot, our colleague Walter Bach is sitting here. You want to say anything, Walter? Walter doesn't want to say anything. We proceed. Okay.
I hadn't seen Walter Bach in the audience, but I want to thank him because we spoke. I don't know if he remembers, but we spoke very, very early on after I met Peter and Rosemary Grant, and it was a valuable conversation that enhanced my excitement about the Grant's work. He was very generous with his time.
Something I just don't understand. Isn't there selection among selections? That is to say, surely I would suppose some of the females would simply select losers, and among the selectors who are successful are the ones who select the ones with the hot beak.
Yes.
Isn't there a second-order selection going on there?
Yes, that's right. So there is pressure to be good at picking a mate, in other words, because if you pick badly, you're likely not to pass on those genes, and presumably some of your offspring then are also going to pick badly, and so on, and pretty soon your line dies out. Whereas if you pick well consistently, you're pretty good at handicapping the mates on the desert island and guessing who's going to do well, and your kids are going to do well, and so on. And that can produce these fascinating kinds of arms races, even. There are feedback effects that can take place because if, say, a longer tail on the ancestor of the peacock began to be a hot item at courtship time, and birds, females that chose males with those somewhat more extravagant beaks, had offspring that had those extravagant beaks, and they were chosen by other females. Well, pretty soon, if you aren't attracted to and you aren't choosing a male with one of those fancy beaks, your offspring are going to lose out. And if you're a male, it behooves you to, all of this is anthropomorphic and metaphorical, but if you have a larger beak, a larger tail, we're at the other end now, the selection pressure, sexual selection pressure, is going to drive a more extravagant tail. And what can end up happening, as happened with those peacocks, is that sexual selection pressure has driven such a huge, fancy, and eye-catching tail that it's probably disadvantageous from the point of view of natural selection, but the sexual selection has outweighed that. And that's an interesting set of arguments, the evolutionary arms race. It's also called sometimes the Red Queen hypothesis, in honor of the Red Queen in Alice in Wonderland, who said, here you can run just as fast as you can, you have to run just as fast as you can just to stay in the same place.
Two more questions.
So I was just thinking about. Whoa, sorry.
Yeah.
I was just thinking about your argument about why evolution is insulting to people, and I thought that there was kind of an interesting irony in that. And if I could also anthropomorphize that evolution itself has selected for this idea of the self and the importance of the self because it has some utility, but at the same time, it's kind of I think it's ironic that tendency has also made it less likely for people to accept it, right? So, so to some extent, this idea that there is the self that is, that we do, there's this agency of humans, right? And that evolution, the idea of evolution and of science as explaining things that are not as much under our control is threatening to that. But, that has been selected for because of some utility, right?
Presumably, it's an interesting point, and if it's true, it's one of the ironies of our existence. But it's not necessarily true, of course, that every striking feature of every species was selected for in the course of natural selection. I mean, our awareness of ourselves, our consciousness of being alive, and the finches, presumably, their different consciousness, or the bats. I mean, we don't really understand this. Again, as Nagel is saying, this is territory we just don't get. And it's possible that awareness is a problem even for the finches and the bats, and that we would all be better off without it. I mean, I'm just arguing this to point out that we don't really know that awareness is a product of natural selection. It may be some sort of byproduct, what Stephen Jay Gould called a spandrel. We don't know. Of course, it's very interesting to wonder what sorts of pressures might have caused it. And some people have argued that it's like the peacock's tail, that it's great at mating time to be more aware of your prospective mates and what they're thinking. And it's a showpiece in courtship to be sensitive to what your prospective mate is feeling. I mean, we're kind of coming back to Valentine's Day here. It's valuable. It's really valuable to be self-aware and to be able to get outside yourself and empathize with what it's like to be the person across the table from you. And maybe that selection pressure, that sexual selection pressure, was part of what drove our awareness. And obviously there are benefits in the struggle for existence that natural selection might have chosen. But the counterintuitive argument is also out there, and it's been made particularly well by Kurt Vonnegut in his novel Galapagos. Did you ever read that? Well, it's fun. He argues that our big brains are our undoing, and and the way he argues it is to imagine a cruise ship going to the Galapagos just at a moment when some virus sweeps the Earth and makes everybody on Earth infertile, except for that little group going to the Galapagos. And they land, and now just like the Finches, they pair off, they have kids, they have kids, they have kids, and lo and behold, the new evolutionary direction that people take is farther and farther away from their big brains and self-awareness, and they end up very happily being sort of seal-like or dolphin-like swimming around the islands. So that's another point of view.
I'm cognizant of the time, and Andrew is saying one more question. Okay, we'll take one last question, then I want to summarize with a question myself. And please. Good.
I'd like to thank you once again for your talk. I'm very interested still in the biology of this, and bear with me here. You mentioned something earlier about, it seems to me that, the beaks got bigger, and then just the course of events led the beaks to get smaller again. And not just bigger and smaller, but very specific sculpted changes. Sure. Yeah. So it seems to me that there's some sort of evolutionary equilibrium that nature's sort of setting. Could you talk a little more about this and tell us what sort of breaks this equilibrium and causes change beyond this just microevolution from back and forth to something that's macro, from ape to man, for example? It's a great question, and it's probably a good one for us to end on also, because that's the question, how you go from microevolutionary changes like this to macroevolutionary changes, like maybe Tyrannosaurus Rex-like creatures to Finch-like creatures. How do you go from the little fluctuating changes to permanent, incrementally accumulating changes that lead to really striking surprises in the tree of life? And the word you used, equilibrium, is well chosen. Again, we're talking about a bunch of birds trapped on a desert island. And there isn't that much room for change on this desert island. There are exceedingly wet years during El Nino events. There are very dry years when hardly any rain falls or none at all. But it's still Daphne Major. The grad students of Peter and Rosemary's have called it the biggest ashtray in the world. It looks like an ashtray floating in the middle of the Pacific, and there's not a lot going on there. So you can well understand why pressures might swing one way or another, but the environment overall doesn't change that much in the lifetime of these birds. So you've got equilibrium. But if the first colonists
arrived at Daphne, maybe in an El Nino, in some freak wind, like the kind of freak weather that you get with Niños, then things were way out of equilibrium for those birds, and they weren't going to swing back. They were stuck on Daphne Major. They weren't going back to mainland Ecuador. And so changes accumulated and accumulated. The grants have calculated that a surprisingly small number of generations of the evolutionary change that they've measured in a drought year or in a very wet year would be enough to produce a new species of finch if sustained. I think we're only talking about 50 generations or something like that. Not a really long time. That's 50 years or less in the lives of these finches. 50 years of breeding. And that presumably would have taken place some million years ago when those finches first landed. So you need an event that punctures the equilibrium. It can be, again, geographic isolation arising suddenly in one bad night, in one bad storm. It can be a mutation. The result of the isolation of a gene pool is inevitably going to be, if the gene pool continues to prosper and those genes keep getting passed on, is going to be slow change that continues in that pool, and here we all are.
Jonathan, let me close this by thanking you and trying to address what I think you try to address here in a very brave and generous way. That is the burden of subjective emotional experience as data, in a sense. When one is here, one has those experiences. The burden I see that you didn't address, that I'd like to hear what you think about, is that from the scientific side of things, we understand this process to be intrinsically imperfectible, and to value only variations, never to approach a perfect state. That seems to me to be profoundly like being in mud compared to what one imagines to be perfectible. Would you want to say anything about that by way of closing this?
That's interesting. I have to think about that. It's a deeper question than I'm really ready to answer, but the chord that it strikes, just this morning in my seminar for young science writers, we had a visit from a historian of science named Daniel Kevles, and Dan is an old friend who teaches the history of science at Yale and is very interested in the history of the eugenics movement, among other things. He also wrote an authoritative book about the history of the 20th century physics. So Dan was showing us all of these harrowing posters of not only Nazi eugenics, but also United States eugenics, because we led the way here in this country in the first part of the 20th century and helped to inspire Hitler's eugenics. And what animates all those posters here and in Germany and in England, it was a cousin of Darwin's, as you probably know, Francis Galton, who popularized this idea of eugenics, was a notion of perfectibility, that now that we understood evolution, we could take it in our hands and we could mold perfect people. We could make ourselves perfect. And of course, perfect depends on where you live and what you think is the hot beak, I guess, and to crack wise where one shouldn't. But the Aryan image was the idealized Aryan baby in those posters actually, when one stops to think about it, looked absolutely nothing like Adolf Hitler himself. But it was a vision of perfection, and these visions of perfection have hovered over every human enterprise forever. Once one has been around the block a few times, one has the perspective to sense that they are irrevocably doomed, that you're not going to get from here to there, you're not going to get to perfection. And there's much one could say about that. There's a lot one could say. But I think it's a dangerous mistake to imagine that we can improve on even a fly. In fact, some of the fly guys have pointed out to me that in more than 100 years now of breeding flies and experimenting with the genes of the flies, we know those genes in the fly a lot better than we did when Thomas Hunt Morgan, within a stone's throw of here, first started with the first fly room. And nobody's ever improved on the fly. So why we imagine that we'll be able to improve ourselves is mysterious and represents the kind of error that a philosopher like Nagel is trying to steer us away from.
Thank you.